panel who I'll introduce you to in just a moment. But first of all, a word about ICON. ICON is a global provider of drug development solutions and services to pharma, biotechnology, medical device, government and public health organizations. The company specializes in the strategic development, management and analysis of programs that support clinical development, from compound selection of phase 1 to 4 clinical studies. They are founded and headquartered in Dublin since 1990. ICON currently operate from 90 locations in 37 countries and have approximately 13,680 employees. The Science Gallery probably don't need any introduction. They are an integral part of Trinity College since 2008, and their mission is to engage young people in looking at the world from the kind of prism of science and art and where they intersect. And since they have opened, more than 3 million people have been through the Science Gallery and experienced 45 unique exhibitions ranging from design and violence to light and love, from contagion to biomimicry. The Science Gallery has done it all, and today is no different. The Living With series is a series set up in association with the Science Gallery and ICON, where they look at the kind of chronic diseases that people are living with in Ireland and around the world, of course, on a daily basis, on what can be expected in the future for those people by way of science and treatment. But the human experience is key here too. I am Dr. Ciara Kelly. I am a medical doctor and a broadcaster, and I will be chairing, but not talking too much, I hope, this afternoon. To our panelists, let me introduce them to you. We have Dr. Anthony O'Connor, who is a gastroenterologist in Tallaght Hospital, who works very much so with patients suffering with inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome. We have Professor Pat Walsh, who works as a research scientist in the National Children's Research Centre. We'll be talking about the science behind the treatments for inflammatory bowel disease. We'll be talking particularly today, when we talk about gut feeling, about the microbiome, all the interaction of the flora that lives upon us and within us, and how it could be the key to treatment. And I will be talking to both Amy Kelly, who is a broadcaster, a presenter and a producer, and to Darren Donohue, who is an award-winning playwright, both of whom suffer from Crohn's disease, or live with Crohn's disease is probably a better description, about their view and how it has been for them being diagnosed, living with and being treated for an inflammatory bowel disease. Let me come to you first, Amy, and ask you, you are a relatively young woman. You have had a diagnosis that hasn't been there that long, only about a year since you were diagnosed with Crohn's disease. Tell me firstly, how did you present and how did you feel being told you had a chronic condition you were going to have to live with?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me as part of the panel. It's a very interesting discussion today. I was in my eyes, and that's something I was getting checked just before I was about to go traveling, so it was really recent. And then like things like pain using the toilet, blood, and all these kind of things, I suppose, became quite normal to me. And so I was kind of dealing with that for definitely over a year, and probably some symptoms even prior to that year. So when I returned from traveling in November, I restarted my career, and again, just putting the symptoms down to feeling run down, being busy, you know, going back to work. I was starting to get the blisters in my eyes again, and I was being told that, you know, that's probably because you were away from a screen for quite some time, and now you're back on, like, you know, using a screen, so that might have affected it. And that kind of went on for some time. And over Christmas, I really just wasn't feeling myself at all, and I found myself very emotional, knowing that I wasn't okay. And then from around February time, I remember being in work and sitting one day and getting this shooting pain in my stomach, really, really bad pain. And it was so bad that any activity I did, whether that was turning in the bed, whether that was changing the clutch in the car, whether, you know, anything at all, getting up out of a chair, it was all really, really impacting me, and it was really, really painful. But unfortunately, like many people living with IBD, these kind of symptoms can become your norm. And I very much thought it was just something in my head, or, you know, it was going to go away, or, you know, this kind of mindset I had. So I did eventually go and get it checked out. Unfortunately, for that first initial check that I had a couple of, I suppose urine samples done. didn't get to the end of it, and it didn't go any further. I wasn't given any sort of a diagnosis or referral or anything. And unfortunately, I pushed on for another 2 weeks from that time, thinking that it was all in my head, that, you know, I've gotten it checked out, you know, nothing came up. So it must all be in my head. Unfortunately, then I was admitted to hospital with the pain just got so bad. And unfortunately, I had a perforation on my small intestine. So I had burst a small hole in my small intestine, and I had abscess either side, and fluid leaking either side as well. So I was quite sick. And I remember being, I look back and kind of laugh now in one sense. I remember being in the emergency room and just feeling so ill. We actually had just gotten back from a trip from Liverpool. We got off the boat, the ferry, and went straight to A&E. It was a terrible time. But we got there, and I got my bloods done at the start, and you know, I was like, look, if it is anything urgent, they'll obviously tell me. So waited a couple of hours in A&E, went into the doctor, and he had a check on my bloods, and he kind of just went, oh wait, what about that? Like, that doesn't seem right. And he looked at me and looked at the bloods, and I was like, okay, don't panic. I was like, what? So my bloods, I know, like, they're usually between, like, I think 0 and 8, and then anything over 10 is a sign of an infection. Mine was 129. So I was quite unwell, but I was just so happy and relieved, to be quite honest, that I knew there was something wrong with me, and I was really happy to be feeling that I was going to be getting to the bottom of it. So I was in hospital for 9 days getting various tests and treated, and to be quite honest, at that time the majority of the feeling I did feel was relief. It was confused at the start with appendix, so there was a bit of discussion about there. I was, of course, naturally devastated to find out that I had a lifelong condition, but because I had had it for so long, I was just so happy that I was getting treated, and, you know, I was getting to the bottom of it. I suppose following on from leaving hospital then, you know, as I said rightly, I'm a year, I suppose, diagnosed now. It's really only now that I find that I'm coming back to myself. It takes a very long time, I suppose, to process it all. Like I again, as I say, like, I was quite positive when I was first diagnosed. I got involved in the ISCC, you know, I wanted to you know, meet people living with the condition, but it wasn't until June, so around a year ago now, that my I suppose the mental health impact that I had really came to light, and I just found myself crying and really emotional about it, and it really felt like I finally hit that this was forever. You know, and simple things like, I'm on a Humira injection, that's what my medication will be. Even simple things like having to do the Humira injection, I just found myself crying when I had to do that. So I went and done CBT in where I was in hospital, and it was fantastic, and that was something that I found stood to me. And even, you know, I say that within a year of getting diagnosed, I never thought that I would be dealing with a global pandemic within that year, but I found that the CBT definitely stood to me, you know, in this regard as well. It's been such a long road. You know, I focused on my mental health for the first few months. Like in January this year, I started going to the gym and getting my physical health back up, and obviously we unfortunately had to stop the gyms. So I don't know if that's a sign or not, but you know, it's I suppose it's a knock-on thing. I took things in stages, and that was my response. And I learned through CBT to have compassion for myself and not be so hard, because when you're diagnosed with a long-term condition, and it doesn't matter what condition it is, it does have an effect on you, on your mental health, and you need to just give yourself that time to allow that space, and, you know, to decompress all
yeah.
happened.
And obviously you now know people who have a family bowel condition because you are involved in ISCC, but maybe in the beginning, I'm guessing you didn't necessarily know anybody, so you didn't have peers going through this.
I had one really good school friend, and funnily enough, she was diagnosed the year before. She was a hugely fantastic support to me. And, you know, even when I was in hospital, she was texting me, telling me what to ask, you know, double check this, and, you know, that kind of stuff. So she was great from that perspective. But yeah, what I did find was that when I started telling people I was been diagnosed with Crohn's disease, there was so many people who had it who never spoke about it. There were so many people who knew somebody who had it. You know, I didn't realize, I suppose, the broad scope of IBD and how much, you know, we are as a community aware of it, but nobody's talking about it. So it's very interesting from that point of view to me. So now I have a fantastic network of people that I can definitely talk to about it. And now I've found that, you know, what I experienced was, you know, was very difficult, but it also wasn't unusual. And a lot of people who have IBD have gone through a very similar journey as well, which is very comforting.
Darren, can I bring you in? Would Amy's experience mirror your experience, as in, did you live with symptoms for a long time maybe before you looked for help, and when you looked for help initially people kind of went, oh, you're probably fine and all of that? Was that a similar journey for you?
I unfortunately I only caught the start of Amy speaking, and then my connection went.
Oh,
and I had to come back in, so I only caught the start and the end.
Science, it's all technical and science. And basically, I think to summarize what Amy said was that she kind of, it became her normal that she might have pain, or she might have diarrhea or blood, and you know, she had blisters in her mouth or her eyes, but she didn't necessarily put it down to anything chronic or serious. She kind of thought, oh, I'm a bit stressed, I'm a bit run down, and she herself long fingered maybe looking, but when she first went to get checked as well, the GP kind of did a rudimentary check and went, you're probably fine as well. So she lived with Crohn's disease, clearly active Crohn's disease, for a considerable period of time before she was diagnosed and treated properly. Yeah,
that was similar to me as well. And I went to a GP as well, and was told that I was fine, it was something else. But I actually ended up in A&E in hospital because my Crohn's had progressed to the stage where I had a fistula. So it was quite a serious operation. I went into St. Luke's in Kilkenny, and I was there for quite a long time trying to recover from the operation. And I lost too much weight. And because the operation, the surgery was so severe, and the area had to be packed, I was on quite a lot of pain medication, which meant I couldn't eat. So it was kind of a vicious circle of being under anesthetic every day to get the area packed. And then I was fasting because I had to go under anesthetic. So I was really on a downhill spiral. I didn't really have a clue what was happening, to be honest, because I'd never heard of Crohn's disease. None of my family ever had Crohn's disease. There's no history of it. And I was transferred then to St. Vincent's. And that's kind of when my recovery began. And I was put on infliximab, which had an immediate beneficial effect for me. And I began to recover over the stage. This is 10 years ago. This is when I was originally diagnosed 10 years ago. I began to recover over the period of about 6 to 8 months, recover from the surgery. But unfortunately, once I'd recovered and I had to go through it all again, which was, I was a father for Mel at that stage. So it was, there was a huge amount of guilt and the feeling of being away from your family, not being able to be there and provide, and watch my daughter grow up and all that kind of stuff. So I was very emotional. I was in hospital for roughly 6 to 8 months until I came out of this. And then once I recovered, I really recovered. I recovered great and went into remission for a period of 9 years. So in that time, I was running, I could eat whatever I wanted, could drink whatever I wanted. So I have to say it was probably, I probably went into denial a little bit about the actual condition and said, maybe I don't have it, or I have. There's part of your mind that definitely was telling me that all the time that I didn't have this. And I really had to struggle with denial and come to terms with the fact of living with this condition, of being a lifelong condition and everything that involves. So in that time period, I was taking infliximab. So I was taking that every 8 weeks through an IV. And it was working fantastic, a really positive response to it, until I became immune to it. which is unfortunately what happens with people in myself and Amy's position, that eventually you become immune to the medication. And I became quite sick again last May. And I went through the same thing as I did 9 years ago. So I was back into hospital again, a lot of infection, a lot of operations. That's why I'm lying down here now. I'm actually recovering from surgery. So it has been a roller coaster. It's been an absolute nightmare, to be honest.
A huge impact.
I'd love to sugarcoat it, but like it's been very challenging. In terms of work life, there are long periods where you're forced to work from home, and you are confined to 2 rooms for I've been confined to 2 rooms for a lot of this year, the bedroom and I tried Humira I have to replace infliximab, and that didn't work either. So now I'm currently on Stelara, which seems to be having a positive effect and seems to be working for me. But you know, it's interesting with the pandemic hitting, as Amy was saying as well, because I've been under lockdown for roughly the last 9 months. So I'm an expert at this stage. I could write a manual on how people could survive it. But hopefully now I'm beginning to recover, and I'm beginning to come out the other side. But I'm still recovering from the surgery, and I'm still trying to put on weight, because one of the side effects is that you lose mountains of weight. So I'm trying to recover from going down to 7.5 stone, which wasn't ideal. New wardrobe was needed, but so I'm actively trying to put on weight, which my wife hates. She's like, I want to lose weight. You're actively trying to put it on. It's not fair. So it has been a real roller coaster, and I'm a playwright, so I'm resident artist in the in Science Gallery at the moment, and I'm writing a play looking at how technology can support people with chronic illness. So basically what I'm trying to do is turn this negative, challenging experience positive, or something I can use in my creative practice, and maybe, you know, spread the word. I don't like using the word educate, because I don't think art is there to educate people. I think documentaries can do that, but art can definitely enlighten people on, you know, my situations, people in my situation, and you know, people suffering with chronic illness in general, who are forced to work from home over long periods, and what are the positive and negative effects in that? How can technology can support it, and the internet? So that's been a rough overview of my journey.
Obviously an enormous impact in every way on your life. Can I bring you in, Anthony, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
You hear 2 stories there. You hear Amy and Darren. Both of them, I suppose, were unwell for a considerable period of time before it was picked up, and then massive impact on their life. Is that kind of a general way that we see inflammatory bowel conditions kind of affect people, that for a long time people are living with it, it becomes their normal, and eventually it becomes so bad? Both of them ended up in A&E and got their diagnosis that way. Is that kind of typical?
Unfortunately, it is. It's all too common. We had a study from Canada a number of years ago that suggested people waited up to 9 years for a diagnosis, and that's in a very advanced healthcare system. I think the difficulty lies in the fact that the symptoms that we see people experiencing with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are common to lots of other conditions as well, like irritable bowel syndrome, bile acid malabsorption, diverticulosis, things like that. So what we need to get better at is finding a way of selecting the people who need to be more closely investigated with colonoscopies and biopsies and scans, and getting them done quicker. We are getting better at that. Most hospitals in Ireland now would have access to what we call non-invasive fecal testing, where we look for certain proteins in the stool that suggest that there's inflammation going on somewhere in the colon. And that enables us to prioritize patients in whom we think we might find diagnoses like this, so as to get their colonoscopies a little bit more quickly than people who don't necessarily have those findings. So when we look at people's stool and blood, we can get a better picture of what's going on there. And obviously, endoscopy, colonoscopy, as you'll know from your work as a GP, it's a very limited resource. We anywhere I've worked in the world, it's always been a problem access to endoscopy. So if we can prioritize that, so as people like Darren and Amy can get the right diagnosis and the right treatment a bit better, then that's a very good thing.
Okay. And in terms of the treatment, both of them were talking about being on biologicals and working and not working. And in Amy's case, things are going well, and she feels she's getting her life back. But obviously Darren has had a very difficult, protracted course with, like, particularly in Kilkenny, that sounded like a nightmare. You can only imagine losing all the weight, starving, anesthetics on a daily basis. Like, that must feel like that is your life, and it is a much diminished life. Treatments have improved and they have changed and they have emerged. Are we seeing a trend that we're moving in a direction with the kind of inflammatory diseases?
There are a couple of trends that we've noticed. Now, just to make one point, I suppose Darren made reference to infliximab, which was the first biologic we got our hands on. Really, we haven't gotten our hands on a better one than that. What we do have is more choice now, though, for patients in whom infliximab is eventually rejected, and whom infliximab, everybody will develop antibodies to it over time. But when infliximab is no longer effective, but the patient still has disease that demands treatment, then we have lots of other options that we can give now that we wouldn't have even had about 5 years ago. So that's great. I suppose one of the things that we as a community of gastroenterologists and scientists have to figure out is where exactly in the treatment algorithm all these different drugs fit. Surgery is still a great option for a great many patients with inflammatory bowel disease. And I always try to introduce to my patients the idea that, at some parts of your disease, some medications are going to be the right thing. At other junctures of the disease course, different medications might be. And at some other junctures, again, surgery is the right option. So it's a dynamic thing. Patients like Amy and Darren will live with this condition for, 50, 60, 70 years. So, the right treatment at one point in not necessarily the right treatment at another course. We're getting more the medications that have come on in recent years that are, let's say, as effective as the original infliximab and adalimumab. So I'm talking about things like vedolizumab, ustekinumab. The one thing about them is they do seem to be safer. They see that we tend to see fewer side effects. That's great because they're possibly a little bit more specific to the gut alone, and we don't tend to get the side effects in other parts of the body. So that's one thing that's great. And there are some other new medications that are out, like tofacitinib, which are biological medications that can actually be given by mouth, which again, makes life a lot easier for the patients. I suppose one thing we're really missing at the moment, though, is a drug that really attacks the root cause of inflammatory bowel disease. So the medications that we use, we call them shoot the messenger drugs almost, because they're not actually getting at the underlying cause, but they're stopping the bullets the immune system is firing at the gut. What we need, and I'm sure Pat will elaborate on this a bit more, what we need is drugs that actually get at the disease process to begin with and stop the abnormal immunity to start on day one.
Okay. On that note, let me bring you in, Pat, Professor Pat Walsh. You've heard two experiences of living with an inflammatory bowel condition. You've heard what you said about treatment, and treatment has improved, and we still use surgery and all of that. But you're working at the coalface in terms of research. There is lots to talk about immunotherapies. There is lots to talk about the microbiome and all that. Are we getting closer to dealing with the root cause, as Anthony describes it, of these conditions?
We're learning all the time. I think when you talk about a root cause for a disease as complex as Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, I think oftentimes it varies from individual. And I think that would be the kind of consensus that there may not be a fits-all silver bullet to treat diseases. And I think one of the challenges, even with the drugs that the guys have been mentioning, is to try and predict. And it was interesting listening to Darren with regards to his experience and some of the biotherapeutics he either lost responsiveness to because he generated an immune response to it, or they weren't as efficacious. So even with the drugs that we have in our arm, one of the things that we're trying to do is to try and figure out before you start treatment whether a patient will actually be responsive, and to try and find out whether they are a good fit for that particular course of treatment. Anthony listed off quite a few immunomodulatory drugs that are either coming to the clinic or have been in the clinic in more recent times. And you know, he rightfully pointed out that they are safer, and that's based on a greater understanding we have of the particular mechanisms that drive the inflammation. So we're not globally immunosuppressing patients. And I think that's likely to continue. But I suppose one of the great unknowns for these diseases really is the environmental component, which brings in the whole area of the microbiome. So for a long time, people have focused on genetic susceptibility. And it was interesting that Darren mentioned that there's no history of Crohn's disease anywhere in his family. I think we now believe that while genetics is an important driving factor, it's probably not as significant unless it's in combination with some as yet relatively undefined environmental factors. And the big elephant in the room there is the intestinal microbiome.
Okay. Can you explain just people who are listening why your gut flora seems to have this crucial role, not only in types of intestinal disease, but in other types of disease as well? Because it's become something people have talked about quite a lot for maybe the last 5 years, even a bit longer than that. But before that, I have to say, when I was in training and everything, never heard of it. How do we think that our microbiome is so, I suppose, influential in terms of all of these things?
Well, I think it's something that we've evolved with over millions of years. To have these microbes, if you like, living not just in the intestine, although the vast majority of microbes living on the body are actually resident in the intestine, but also on the skin and at other mucosal surfaces. And if you think about it, just in the broadest sense, if you were to take all of the microbial species living on your body, it probably represents up to 3% of your entire body weight. So it's like something that we have developed or evolved over time to live with in a kind of a symbiotic fashion. So the bacteria that are there actually help us developmentally and help us physiologically, and we've evolved together over time. Does that make sense?
It does, although in my possibly very stupid head, I'm thinking we're a bit like planet Earth, and the microbiome is like the humans that are living on planet Earth and how they are affecting the planet. Is it a bit like that, or am I really
that's
embarrassing myself now?
No, that's actually not a bad analogy, really. I think people's appreciation of it has changed quite dramatically over the last 20 years, because if you think of it just in terms of, let's say, cell numbers, right? So in the human body, you will have X number of cells. You have actually 10 times as many microbial cells living on your body at the same time. Probably more significant if you're thinking in terms of genetics and genes. So we know that there's 23,000 genes in the human genome, each of which has the potential to have a functional consequence, be it either in health or disease. You're talking about over 3 million genes within the microbial communities that are living on your body. Equally, you know, potentially have the ability to alter health or disease as well if things go wrong. So it's a huge potential. And the way I kind of think of it simplistically is that in its entirety, the microbiome is almost like another organ of the body, because we've evolved in that fashion over time. So it seems intuitive. even though we don't fully understand it, but it seems intuitive that it will play a very important role, not just in disease, but in how we normally develop. And we're only really starting to figure out how that might be.
Amy, you've heard all the talk there about science and about treatments and all that. One of the things that jumped out was something Anthony said. For me, it jumped out, and I was wondering what you thought of it. He said, well, they'll obviously have to learn to live with this for 60 or 70 or 80 years. Did your heart sink when he said that, or did you kind of go, yes, I'm able for this because this is all fine, or does that seem like a bit of a millstone?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted there, apologies. It's tough when you look at it that way, and it's now that I can kind of focus on, be like, okay, well, I'm well now. It's very difficult when you're first diagnosed, and even if you have a similar kind of journey as Darren had spoken about, it can take very much a toll on you. You know, when you're looking ahead and looking at, this is my future now, this is with me forever, wherever I go. You know, even things for me, you know, my first couple of questions to my consultant was, am I able to get pregnant, you know, in the future? You know, like all these concerns and all these things that, you know, in one way, I think we can all naturally take for granted when we don't have a chronic illness, or when we're not diagnosed, because, you know, we all just imagine this path that we're going to live, or, you know, we have our lives mapped out. But I suppose when you're stopped in your tracks and diagnosed with a chronic illness, and you have to take that step back and think, it is quite difficult. I find it very overwhelming. I don't find it as overwhelming now, because I now see that, thankfully, touch wood, I'm in remission, and I'm living well at the moment. But it's very overwhelming. You know, it is very overwhelming. Yeah. I do feel like with the nature of IBD, you know, it's not the most attractive illness to have. You know, it's not, you know, something that we all like talking about. Like, I personally love talking about it. I don't know if it's a thing from when I went traveling to Southeast Asia, but I don't know if anyone else has gone traveling to Southeast Asia, but for some strange reason, talking about your toilet habits happens everywhere you go when you meet people. And I don't know why that happens, but it, you know, you start talking to strangers about it, so I don't know if I got comfortable then talking about it, or but you know, it's important to talk about it, and especially because I had the symptoms for so long, I very much encourage people to talk about it, and recommend that. But it is difficult, and I think you need to allow yourself that space to, as I say, decompress, and, you know, realize that this is something that you're going to have for the rest of your life, you know.
Yeah. And can I bring Darren in with you there, Amy? Both of you work in creative fields. Like, Amy, you're working in television and radio, and Darren, obviously, you're a playwright and you're the artist in residence in the Science Gallery. But this must interfere with work, particularly because you're not in, you know, you don't have a permanent pensionable job like some people might have. Has it been very challenging to sort of have to take time out of work in an insecure industry, I suppose? And has it kind of influenced your work choices? Because it's all very well and good if you were working as a civil servant or something where you can take time out and you'll be looked after properly and all of that. That's not the same sort of situation if you're freelance, or indeed if you're a writer.
Well, it's strange that this is happening, that question is happening during the pandemic and the lockdown, because if we were having this conversation in a room together today in the Science Gallery, I couldn't be there.
Yeah.
But I can be here, zooming it with you, and you all think it's normal, and everybody who's watching it is now saying this is the new normal, where we can have this kind of a discussion through Zoom. And a lot of my work, say readings of plays or whatever, are now happening over Zoom, and they have to happen over Zoom, and everybody thinks it's fine, you know, and they think nothing of it now, but it's absolutely at the moment the way it has to happen for me. So, you know, every cloud has a silver lining. Just one thing that I want to mention that is huge and has been a major life-changing turning point for me has been diet. And I don't think it's been mentioned yet, but
no, I was going to get to it, but fire ahead.
Just in terms of me personally, changing my diet radically and significantly to certain things like no sugar and low fiber and no dairy, you know, and no yeast. You think what's left? But you know, I eat a lot of fish.
What is left? What do you eat? Well, and I'm not being facetious. What kind of food would you eat on a daily basis?
Actually, regimented eating routine, and it's best for me if I eat small amounts over the course of the day rather than 3 large meals. I don't eat after 5:30. I drink lots of water. Since I've been really sick this time, I've eaten the same thing every day, which is basically a kind of a vegan Mediterranean diet. So lots of rice, fish, and it's really helped me in terms of going to the bathroom and all of that. The diet has made a major impact.
Darren, can I ask, have you designed this diet yourself through trial and error? Or have you worked with dietitians to establish this diet?
The thing is that this is a complete minefield because, as Pat and Anthony were saying, this is so individual to each person. Or your diet. Certain things will work for you, they won't work for somebody else. Somebody else will swear by a diet, you'll try it and you'll get worse. So you really have to go on a journey of trial and error to find out what suits you. And what happens is, if you investigate it online, you get contradictory advice all the time. And I found this a huge problem, because what happened was that every time I tried something, a professional, somebody who has studied this whole field, would tell me not to do it, that this doesn't work. And it has been probably the most, is to try and find the right advice out there and to try garner all the bits of it together and then go on the journey of trial and error to find out what suits you. And that's incredibly difficult because you take a lot of wrong turns on that journey.
Can I bring you in, Anthony? Amy has mentioned that she found CBT amazingly helpful in all of this. Darren has mentioned that he found diet one of the key pillars. Do we need a hugely multidisciplinary approach to the treatment of things like this? Like, and people, you know, and as Darren said, people are talking about FODMAPs, but then they're talking about vegans or ketos, and like it is an extraordinarily broad field, and food and people zealot-like about their particular diet is an issue in general health. What do you think about I suppose, the ancillary treatments for anything from irritable bowel to inflammatory bowel conditions?
I suppose the big thing I would say is I don't see them as ancillary. I think they are a huge part of the treatment. And this is a bit of a bugbear and a hobby horse of mine, that if you look at surveys of IBD patients in all territories, in all parts of the world, consistently, over and over and over again, the symptom that they report as being the most troubling symptom for them is fatigue. It comes out top all the time. And if you look at, there was a survey done in the UK a couple of years ago of how doctors and IBD nurses respond to fatigue being reported. We don't really go into it. We tend to skim past it. Only about 1/3 of doctors and nurses engaged in IBD treatment will actually ask you about diet, exercise, and are you getting enough sleep? And if you told your mum you were feeling fatigued, those would be the first questions she'd ask you. So there's a huge disconnect between what matters to patients with IBD, and that's around the fatigue, sometimes the continence piece, dietary pieces, and what we actually look at in major detail as clinician scientists. So last year, if you look at the 2 big journals in gastroenterology, there were 28 original papers on IBD. None of them used patient-reported outcomes as a primary endpoint. Okay, so what that means really is all these symptoms like fatigue and pain that patients are coming to us with, you know, we can turn around and give them a treatment that we say, yes, we've got an evidence base that this works, in the same way as, you know, we listed out some of the treatments earlier that are really good for healing fistulas, for taking ulcers out of your bowel, for keeping you off steroids. But, you know, a lot of the problems that patients really, really report, you know, the treatments we have, we don't know if they do anything for them. And I think that's where kind of having a better understanding, having dietitians on your team, having psychologists on your team, and the IBD nurse as the sort of glue that holds the whole thing together is incredibly important. And just to sort of to pick up on some of the themes that Darren discussed and that Pat sort of alluded to as well, is, you know, this isn't one disease really. I mean, if you look at somebody who's got small bowel and strictures and fistulas, then they're going to have a very different experience to somebody who's got ulcerative colitis just affecting the top layer of the rectum. So, you know, a diet, there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all diet. And I think Darren's absolutely right to say it really is sort of a journey of discovery. There will be a lot of patients with, you mentioned IBS as well, Ciara. The rate of IBS in the general population is 15 to 20%. The rate of IBS in patients who have IBD is over 40%. So oftentimes the conditions can coexist together, and that's again where sort of dietary treatments, probiotic treatments do offer us a real chance to improve the lives of IBD patients, but we just haven't been looking at it in the right way in clinical trials, and that's certainly something that we're trying to address here in Tallaght Hospital in the coming years.
And you're hugely published. Like, I'm very interested in what you're saying. Are we as medics too focused on the physical then rather than the holistic, as it were? Because when you talk about things like fatigue and continence, I can imagine those are the things that really affect your quality of life. If you're knackered all the time and you have to run to the toilet and therefore you're planning your day around where the bathrooms might be wherever you go, that's a burden you're living with in a way that you might not even know you had a fistula, although you'd be experiencing, I suppose, symptoms from it. But are we focusing on the sort of the minutiae of the physical and missing, do you think, a big picture?
I think it's important that we do focus on the minutiae, the physical, and that we've got good drugs that offer mucosal healing. But what I've been sort of evangelizing for the last 2 years is that we just afford equal prominence to quality of life, to quality of life related issues like pain, like continence, and like fatigue. You know, we're going to be doing some research next year with Tallaght Hospital and Dr. Sinead Kaur in the Mine Institute inside in Trinity, looking at changes to patients' diet and probiotic supplementation as in altering the microbiome of patients who suffer with fatigue and IBD as a means of trying to...
We bring you back in. We've been talking about, I suppose, living with it, treatments for it, the microbiome and the importance. In the Living With series that we've been doing with the Science Gallery, we've looked at other chronic diseases. We've looked at HIV and cancer and cystic fibrosis. And every time we look at one of these chronic diseases, it seems to me we come back to the immune system, immunology, immunotherapy. Is that going to be the future here as well, do you think? When, you know, when we look going forward, are we seeing that as the expanding area of medical research in terms of controlling all of these types of conditions?
Expanding, yes, but I think you have to look at it more holistically in terms of the interaction with the environment and on an individual basis as well. And that's where the challenge is, because if you think about it, all of us on this call, right, genetically, we're all 99% similar, okay? Yet if you were to look at the microbiome of each of us, it would be up to 80 to 90% different in each individual. And that kind of goes back to what Darren was talking about how there is no one-size-fits-all recommendation for diet, because, you know, it seems intuitive and that diet is going to alter the microbiome. And we know experimentally that the microbiome has a key role in influencing inflammation and the immune system in the gut. I mean, we know that it's particularly important very early in the development of the immune system, especially in the gut. So we know that antibiotic treatment in very early infants has been associated with increased susceptibility to a whole range of inflammatory diseases later in life, such as allergies and eczema. So we know it plays a role, we just don't know the specifics about how it influences the aspects in diseases such as IBD. I think the one consensus that we have, and Anthony mentioned it, is that there is a much lower diversity of the microbiome in the intestines of patients with IBD. But when you're dealing with something which has, you know, trillions of individual microbial cells, looking at global diversity is really only scratching the surface of things, you know. Now we're starting to figure out how within those trillions of cells, particular species of microbes and bacteria can actually influence the processes of inflammation and mucosal healing, and might actually facilitate the resolution of diseases like IBD. So I think when we're looking at inflammation, we need to kind of look at it in a more complex detail, not just from inside the body out, but also how the external environment impacts that. And that's something that we're only really starting to do.
Look, thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our talk, but I think I'll give the last words to Amy and to Darren. Amy, when you look forward, and Darren, I'll ask you the same question. How do you feel about your condition going forward? Even after today's chat, has that changed anything? Or how in general do you feel about, I suppose, living with Crohn's disease?
Well, actually, to link into some of the points that have just been previously mentioned, because it was quite reassuring, you know, following on from the question a while back in relation to job and work life, and I know it was mentioned fatigue. I'm so happy that it was mentioned there, because, you know, that was a huge thing I had felt, and it's kind of now that is, as I say, it was kind of one of the lingering symptoms I had that I now have under control. But that further links into Darren's point, because the reason I have it under control is because I've been living a predominantly plant-based diet. I believe I kind of started back in January, just, you know, trying to do meatless Mondays type thing. And linking into, you know, learning more about my microbiome and what does that mean, and, you know, looking at different research and, you know, finding out about this whole new world that I never had heard of before, and it's great to be able to sit down and have a discussion about it. But I do find that, you know, those that like the holistic way of looking at it, you know, looking at all aspects is really important. As I say, my diet change, and I kind of say, when you've met one person with IBD, you've met one person with IBD. I think people can mean well and say, oh, well, I know somebody who has it and this is what they do and this is great, you know, but, you know, obviously that doesn't work for everybody. You know, so it's kind of, it's important to remember that. And, you know, anyone who's watching, you know, your IBD journey is your journey. You know, and I think even over the past year, you know, because I started to get quite well, even though I had been through in a big thing, and a big kind of look to other people and say, well, I'm not as bad as them, you know, so I can't feel bad. But that's not right either. Of course you can. I think looking forward now, I'm very positive after this conversation. I think it's really, really beneficial to be able to meet Darren, and me and Darren both found out we're both from Kildare, so it's great from that point of view. I know that connecting with somebody else, but also the topics that was discussed, because sometimes when you're living with a chronic illness, you can live inside your head a lot, and you can convince yourself that it's all in my head, you know, and, you know, you can feel very isolated. So these discussions help that, and especially going into this kind of I suppose this topic, I think it needs to be broadly looked at more. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. And Darren, what would you say, I suppose, in close, about how you feel about living with Crohn's going forward?
It's great, everything that Amy said. I completely agree with her. I'll just say very simply that when you come through any illness, and I remember when I was very ill and I eventually came out the other side of it the first time 10 years ago, for a number of weeks you almost live in a state of grace, which is an amazing thing. You can feel the wind. Yeah. You know, you notice things in life. You stop and appreciate the rain. You stand out in the rain. Of course, you can't live like that continually, or you'd be a raving lunatic. But I feel now, and I know it to be true, that any day that I can get out of bed and I can go for a walk and just see my family and really appreciate the small things in life, being able to do the tiny things in life, has been a tremendous gift for me personally. And to be able to stand back and really take a good look at my life and analyze it and consider it, and it's given my life depth. And that has been the gift of Crohn's disease that it's given me, that I certainly wouldn't have been the person I am now without it, and I like how I am. So, you know, I have to see it as a gift as well as a curse. But there's two sides.
Well, look, on that wonderful note, actually, thank you so much to everyone who took part in this Living With lecture in the series in association with the ICON and indeed the Science Gallery. My thanks for taking part to Amy Kelly, presenter, broadcaster and producer, to Darren Donohue, award-winning playwright, to Professor Pat Walsh, Research Science at the National Children's Research Centre, and Dr. Anthony O'Connor, gastroenterologist at Tallaght Hospital. We will be taking questions, I believe, on YouTube as well after this, but thank you to all the people who got involved, all the viewers and the listeners. Thanks very much.